I lost my faith because I moved to Los Angeles and fell victim to the ways of the world. At least that's what happened according to a lot of people who say this every time I open my big fat mouth and talk about my deconstruction on the internet, as I did recently on Howie Mandel's podcast. Listen, I don't expect people to take the time to go and sit through the very long episode of my podcast where I told my story in detail. So I'm going to start talking about some of this stuff in more bite-sized pieces, beginning with this assumption of why I left the Christian faith. My deconstruction began shortly after I graduated from college, when I became interested in the debate about the age of the earth, mostly within the evangelical Christian community. And as I read about the evidence for the earth being about 4.5 billion years old, I encountered some Christians who resisted or dismissed the evidence for that because they thought that it was contradictory to the Bible. I also met a lot of Christians who accepted the evidence for the age of the earth and subscribed to St. Augustine's view captured in his famous quote, "All truth is God's truth." They weren't afraid of scientific truth that seemed to challenge the Bible on the surface because they trusted that both the Bible and good science would always reconcile, and that view really resonated with me. And while I was still a strong believer and a full-time professional Christian missionary at the time, the reason I call this the beginning of my deconstruction is because I was beginning to appeal to an external authority whereby I judged both science and the Bible. I was basing what I believed, at least as much as I was capable of with all my built-in biases and intellectual limitations, of which I have plenty, on the authority of reason rather than the authority of God. Over the course of the next 10 years or so, while I was living in the Bible Belt the whole time, applying this standard of reason to the Bible would slowly but surely erode my faith in the scriptures. As I became convinced of the reasonable conclusions of historians, archaeologists, biologists, and others, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile what I was learning with my view of the Bible. One of the reasons this was such a slow process for me is that I continued to read a lot of very intelligent Christian thinkers who had found ways to resolve these tensions and still maintain their faith. And listen, I still respect and have a lot of close friends who are Christians who have wrestled with these tensions and found a way to keep their faith. But for me, this game of reframing or reinterpreting the Bible or repositioning my faith eventually brought me to a breaking point. I let go of most everything except Jesus. I still had faith that he was the way, the truth, and the life. And this all happened before I ever moved to Los Angeles. Moving to LA in 2011 actually temporarily slowed down my deconstruction because in LA I met a lot of Christians who really embraced the tension and the mystery of maintaining a Christian faith in a very confusing world. But LA did contribute to one thing. I was finally able to consider my faith outside of the cultural pressures of the Bible Belt. I have no problem admitting in LA there is much less pressure to remain in the fold than there was in North Carolina. In the Bible Belt, there are a lot of people who've lost their faith but stay in the church because leaving feels like a worse option. Back to the timeline. About 10 years ago, after being in LA for a couple of years, I finally admitted to myself that while I loved the idea of Jesus, I could no longer believe that he was actually God in human form or that he had been raised from the dead. And at that point, I stopped calling myself a Christian. So I wouldn't say that I left the Christian faith because I moved to Hollywood and fell victim to its vices. I would say that I left the Christian faith when I no longer believed it. I could be wrong. Not only could my reasoning be wrong, but my whole approach might be wrong. I mean, Colossians 2:8 says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." There are a lot of places in the Bible that warn against applying human reason to God. Isaiah even says that God's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. In one sense, I agree with that. God surely defies human reason and understanding. But I don't think that these verses are simply speaking to the deep and unknowable mystery of God. I think they're exactly what you would expect to hear from someone who sensed that human reason and critique might undermine their faith and wanted to protect against that. Okay, that's it for now. Hopefully this has been helpful in understanding where I'm coming from. And I'll keep talking about some of this stuff if it does prove to be helpful to some people out there. Thanks.